This week, we'll be encountering a rather different species of love poetry, a sort of continuation of our discussion on the sonnet. Whereas the sonnet sets out to introduce a problem and resolve it in 14 lines, this week's poetry will not be nearly as minimalistic, and in comparison to last week's readings, nor will it be as discreet. Our first two poems this week will fall into a category known as the Carpe Diem poems, in which the speaker attempts to use his wit and eloquence to seduce his love interest. Today's poems are written from the male perspective, and the object of desire is almost always described as being a woman. She has her reasons for preserving her chastity, which we'll explore later. Her hesitance is acknowledged by the male speaker, but inevitably, the speaker will believe her shyness to be unfounded, and he'll set up a counter-argument to win her over, or at least to try. If this sounds offensive to you, then you're not alone, because no longer does society tolerate this kind of manipulation. After all, no means no, or it's supposed to. But the speakers won't take no for an answer, and it's for this reason that we'll be applying feminist criticism to these Carpe Diem poems. Indeed, feminist criticism is about the empowerment of the female voice in a text, even if it's subdued, and the rebuke of female objectification, all themes that we'll be discussing this week. In saying that, it's important not to see this week's poetry as an indictment of the authors themselves. Yes, it's entirely possible that Marvell and Donne wrote their Carpe Diem poems to win over some love interest, but it's also possible that they didn't. It is possible that they simply saw poetry as a means to demonstrate their wit, and they invented this scenario of a lovesick suitor to stretch their cunning to the farthest degree possible. You see, Marvell and Donne both belong to a school of poetry that we now call the metaphysical school. The metaphysical poets were known for their use of the conceit, which is a type of metaphor wherein two completely unlike circumstances are compared. Poets will often employ the metaphor to draw connections between things that are dissimilar but share enough in common to at least merit the comparison. In A Rose for Emily, for example, Faulkner uses metaphor when he describes Emily Grierson as a fallen monument. Emily is not literally a monument, she's a human being. But the associations that follow when we hear that word describe her status in the story pretty well. She's like the relic of a bygone era, as derelict as her aging mansion. A conceit is differentiated from metaphor in that the distance between the two things is greater, and thus the poet has to exercise greater skill in order to make the connection apparent. For example, a poet may not receive much credit for comparing the beloved's eyes to stars or sapphires, but if they were to compare the beloved's eyes to, say, 2 lumps of coal and mean it in a flattering way, then we'd have the workings of a conceit, and it would be up to the poet to use his or her wit to bring this comparison full circle so it could actually function as a compliment. For Donne, the metaphysical conceit is built into this analogy of the flea bite, which we see in his first poem, The Flea. By now, John Donne should be a familiar name to you because over the last couple of weeks we've encountered some of his devotional sonnets. In Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, the speaker desperately cries out for a greater connection to the divine. He says, "Yet dearly I love you, God, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, shall never be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me." It's interesting to note that before he became an author of devotional poems, Donne concentrated his craft on erotic verse, including a number of Carpe Diem poems. His poetry is wildly intimate, even lightly scandalous, and when he began writing poems about his spirituality, he never lost this burning desire for intimacy. The desire was simply transferred to something else, to God. But in The Flea, we're catching Donne at this early stage of erotic verse. This poem features a speaker who is addressing a love interest, and in the first stanza, the scene is set for us. "Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be." In essence, the speaker is saying, notice this flea, it has bitten me first, and now it bites you, and in this flea our two bloods mingle as one. And I will demonstrate, by this flea's bite, which is a tiny insignificant thing, that what you are denying me is equally insignificant. He goes on, "Thou knowest that this flea bite cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead, or loss of virginity. Yet this, the flea, enjoys before it woo, and pampered, or satisfied, swells with one blood made of two, and this, alas, is more than we would do." Already the speaker is drawing some powerful sexual allusions, which you might find disconcerting because they're being compared to the bite of an insect. The word pampered here has the connotation of meaning sexual gratification, and the innuendo of the line swells with one blood is also quite intentional. The flea has bitten you, my love, and now it holds your blood in its body. It did not have your consent before it did so, but regardless, you do not consider it a sin or a loss of virginity. Now this flea swells with blood, and this is more than we would do, the speaker is saying. Leading into the next stanza, there is a sense of dramatic progress. Some action is happening in the poem. The speaker says, "Oh, stay," meaning wait or stop. Why does he say this? Quite obviously, the beloved has made a move to smite the creature, but the speaker has not finished his analogy, so he says, "Spare this flea. Oh, stay, 3 lives and 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is." The speaker insists that the lovers are now more than married in this marriage bed. I know this might seem a little confusing, so let's break it down a little bit. For point of reference, note that in Donne's time, conception was thought to occur when a man and woman exchanged bloods through intercourse. Physicians had a general understanding that conception involved a discharge of fluid, but they didn't understand what this fluid was. There was no microscope at this point to identify sperm cells, so semen was just considered to have originated in human blood, which brings us back to the statement in the flea that the 2 lovers are now united because their bloods are mingling, just as their bloods would mingle in the actual act of sex. The speaker seems to be insisting that, in a way, we've already had sex. The poem continues, "Though parents grudge, and you, we're met and cloistered in these living walls of jet." By this he means the insides of the flea. "Though use, or habit, make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege, 3 sins, and killing 3. Here's where we get a little context to this relationship. The speaker admits that parents grudge, meaning that the lover's parents do not approve of this affair. Nevertheless, because of the mingling of bloods, the lovers are now cloistered inside the flea's body, and the speaker pleads the lover not to kill the flea, lest 3 sins be committed. 1, the death of the speaker, 2, the self-murder of the lover, and 3, the death of the flea, of course, which amounts to sacrilege, as this marriage temple draws comparisons to the Holy Trinity, 3 sins in killing 3. The third stanza leads with another action. It seems the beloved could not be restrained from killing the flea, because the speaker laments, "Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence." The speaker concludes, "Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphst, and sayest that thou find'st not thyself, nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true. Then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor when thou yield'st to me will waste, as this flea's death took life from thee." There is no indication of whether or not the speaker's deft wordplay has won favor with the beloved. But ultimately, I think what is said is not as interesting as how it is said. The flea showcases the idea of the metaphysical conceit pretty well. I think that's proof that there's always more to a poem than you catch on the first glance. The second metaphysical poem comes to us from Andrew Marvell, who's also lumped into the same category of metaphysical poets as Donne. Marvell's pleading in To His Coy Mistress is a little more direct than Donne's, I think, and offers a more urgent pace as the speaker is working against the clock. The poem begins with these lines, "Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness, lady, were no crime." Coyness in this context is meant to be interpreted as sexual restraint. The speaker is addressing the beloved who is hesitant to indulge in the act of intercourse. Her coyness is considered a crime by the speaker because their time on earth is limited. Otherwise, the speaker admits he could stand to pay endless tribute to her. He writes, "We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day." And he goes on, "My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For, lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate." Such are the praises the speaker would sing if he had the time. But here on this mortal earth, the speaker says that they must seize the day and make the most of their time while they can. The argument changes, and the speaker introduces a rather foreboding image of the fleetingness of time. But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault, by this he means tomb or grave, shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, having laid out the situation at hand, the speaker moves forward to announce his proposal. Now therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our son stand still, yet we will make him run. The conceit comes to fruition here at the last few lines. Though we cannot make our son stand still, we can still make him run. This is a conceit that would have been more effective and pronounced in Marvell's time because it's based on an old myth that states that each act of sex shortens our lifespan by a day, thereby making the sun run or shortening our days. Now, the feminist critique comes from the questions you've likely been asking over the last few minutes. Who is being addressed in the poem, and what is her response to this tribute? The beloved of Donne is treated as if her only hesitations are due to parental objections or her religion. At least these are the objections he chooses to address, and he takes a rather entitled tone with her. The speaker complains that her use or habit makes her apt to kill him, as if he'd been rejected many times before and simply didn't get the hint. Furthermore, even if a flea bite could make a fitting analogy to the act of sex, the argument still boils down to a fallacy that states, since we've basically done it before, we should be able to do it again. Meanwhile, the tributes in Marvell open up with a mostly facile praise. He wants to spend uncounted years immortalizing her beauty. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. But nowhere does the speaker compliment her on her intellect. He builds this image of the ideal woman, but ultimately it seems he's more interested in conquest than companionship. And his quarrel with Time's winged chariot and the shortness of beauty in life really speaks more to his own existential insecurities than anyone else's. Or maybe he's so vapid that he can't imagine having sex with an older woman. Whatever conclusion you draw from these readings, the idea is that you should really question poems like this for what they are and whom they are addressed to. Oftentimes, a poem will paint a rather vivid picture of how people felt and acted in a certain era, and it seems the laws of courtship have become a little more inclusive over time, or at least one would hope. The final poem we'll read this week is a little different from the previous ones in that it's not a carpe diem poem, but rather a dramatic monologue. This is a type of poem that has a strong sense of narrative action about it. It's a poem that usually includes one or more characters and a speaker who is addressing these characters. In the case of Browning's My Last Duchess, the speaker is a wealthy duke, and the addressee is presumably someone with ties to another noble family, and who is likely there to help negotiate a marriage contract. The duke has plans to remarry after the passing of his wife, his last duchess, and as the visitor steps into the art gallery, the duke begins to reveal the circumstances of his wife's death. That's my last duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as if they'd asked me if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. We're not receiving a lot of information about the fate of the Duchess at this point, but we do get some details about the Duke's background. The Duke seems to be powerful and wealthy, or at least wealthy enough to afford a painting by a prestigious artist, and he appears to be in the habit of entertaining guests in this gallery, so he must be a person of high social stature. Also, he reveals something important, that the picture is painted on the wall itself, and hidden behind a curtain which only the Duke has access to. None puts by the curtain but him. We'll revisit this later, but for now let's continue with the poem. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, "Her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much," or "Paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat." Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Now the speaker has directed his attention to the expression of the woman in the painting, her smile, or spot of joy. He begins to reveal some degree of jealousy as he states she was too easily impressed by whatever she looked on. He goes on, "Sir, 'twas all one, my favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling?" Here the details become more damning as the speaker gets increasingly emotional. He can't understand why his last Duchess was able to find joy in all of life's pleasures, and he's incredulous that she didn't exist only to flatter him. His nobility, his gift of a 900-years-old name, he feels should entitle him to special treatment. But she ranked this gift with anybody's gift. She enjoyed his title and his prestige just as she'd enjoy a bowl of cherries. And the Duke, hoping to find some sympathy in his guest, says, "Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling?" He continues, "Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss, or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop." So apparently the Duke was unable to communicate his wishes to the Duchess, or at least make them quite clear. He detests that she would not let herself be lessoned by his demands, and instead challenged his authority. This deals a blow to the Duke's sense of pride, and he makes an eerie revelation, that he is not a man who stoops. He will correct the problem through action rather than words or compromises. He says, "Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together." At this point it's become quite clear that the Duke, unable to deal with his jealousy, has made commands to have the Duchess killed. Thus, all smiles stopped together. After this final chilling revelation, the Duke implores his guest to stand up and meet the company below, which presumably refers to the finalization of this marriage contract. On their way out, the Duke points out one last prestigious piece of art. "There she stands, as if alive. Will't please you rise? We'll meet the company below, then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." My Last Duchess is excellent for feminist criticism because it sets up a damning picture of gender roles. Even if the Duke exists as his own character, we must be able to draw certain parallels between this relationship and other ones from the same time period. The Duke represents a controlling patriarchal figure. He feels he has the authority to educate his wife on matters of etiquette, and to control who she socializes with and how she chooses to socialize. When he doesn't possess the confidence to settle the matter through conversation as a healthy couple should, he has her assassinated and her likeness painted on the wall. We've spoken a bit about the objectification of women in poetry, but the Duchess has quite literally been turned into an object, a painting on the wall that can never speak for itself, never defend itself, and doesn't even see the light of day unless its owner draws back the curtain that covers it. The idea of the male voice dominating over the female voice is a large part of the feminist critical method, as stated by the French critic Hélène Cixous in this excerpt from our criticism handout. Writing has been run by a libidinal and cultural, hence political, typically masculine economy. Nearly the entire history of writing is confounded with the history of reason, of which it is at once the effect, the support, and one of the privileged alibi. It has been one with the phallocentric tradition. It is indeed that same self-admiring, self-stimulating, self-congratulatory phallocentrism. Especially as we talk about the Carpe Diem poems, I think it is possible that there is oftentimes a self-admiring quality to male verse, especially in an era where authors were expected to show their wit and cunning. The speakers of Donne and Marvell show their cunning at the expense of the mistress, who, interestingly enough, exists only as an object to be spoken to in the poem. We see them as vague shadows. Their presence is implied, not described, and feminist criticism is really about the liberation of the female voice. In My Last Duchess, for example, this voice is not only subdued, it's conspicuously absent, as the only female figure is the one who exists in the past tense, and all that we know about her is revealed to us through the words of men. But are we supposed to trust these men? Not really, as Browning portrays the Duke as an unreliable narrator who's not to be trusted. So naturally, we find ourselves exploring the opposite side of the story. In this way, the Duchess becomes the main character of the work, a sort of martyr-like figure of an independent woman who stood up to the patriarchal status quo, and lost, but gets the last smile, and will forever be depicted on the wall with that smile that drove her husband crazy. Perhaps that is why he keeps the curtain closed. Similarly, we cannot know if the speakers of Donne and Marvell were successful in their conquest, but we can imagine possibly that the mistress's response was rather like this one by Annie Finch. Sir, I am not a bird of prey. A lady does not seize the day. I trust that brief time will unfold our youth before he makes us old. How could we two write lines of rhyme were we not fond of numbered time, and grateful to the vast and sweet trials his days will make us meet? The grave's not just the body's curse, no skeleton can pen a verse. So while this numbered world we see, let's sweeten time with poetry, and time, in turn, may sweeten love and give us time our love to prove. You've praised my eyes, forehead, breast. You've all our lives to praise the rest. And I think that's a fitting way to end our discussion of feminist criticism this week.